Hopefully people who are in hotspots or developing COVID hotspots, people in Texas, I know numbers in Kansas are going up, here certainly in California too, so just a note for everyone to stay safe and stay well and stay healthy so I can continue to see everybody every few weeks, even if it's only virtually. Quick housekeeping reminders, please go into speaker mode, and if you can mute yourself, that would be great. And when I just ask for people to shout out ideas, you can feel free to unmute yourself. So I'm excited to talk about bottling. I've had some requests from people for some more technical information. So today I'm going to sort of try to balance some of the technical things that are a little bit maybe drier to some people with just some stories and mishaps about all the things that can go wrong with bottling, and then talking maybe a little bit about packaging and sort of some of the more fun things or entertaining things. So, are you guys ready to get going? All right, so here we go. Let me share my screen with you, and we will start with a picture of me. Hopefully this is going to advance. Okay, there we go. So that's me on bottling day, bottling the rosé. And you can see a gigantic smile on my face. I'm so happy to get that rosé into the bottle. I'm so happy to know that the next day I'm going to get hand cramps from having to hand wax 200 cases of rosé. But at that moment, I'm really happy. And that's atypical because usually bottling day is stressful. So I was just counting in my head. I'm bottling next week on Monday. So I was doing some cross flow filtration today. And this will be my 26th bottling. And every single time you think that you can prepare for everything, and yet, there is always a mishap. So I'm going to start by sharing a Mad Lib with you that I'll read through and I'll post as well. So it says, "Hey, Kareth, I think you've got a problem here." The voice trailed off, smothered by the ambient hum of rattling bottles and bottling machinery. "Mother blank," I sputtered under my breath. My glistening blank blank stood erect beside the truck. It was brand new. I couldn't wait to hand blank my large blank. I was blank with anticipation. I thought I knew what to expect. The day before, I practiced blanking someone else's blank. I'd experimented with the blank, with every thrust inserted the blank into my blank just right. Each push felt blank and blank. I wanted the tip of my blank to barely kiss the lip of the blank, both parts lying flush. It's a matter of wrist action. But today was totally different. When I blanked up, I saw a blank floating inside my first blank, bobbing up and down. Apparently my blank were to blank to plug the blank. Each thrust, blank, pushed my blank straight through and into the blank. I panicked. I tried blanking more. I slowed each arm pump to squeeze my blank more firmly inside. No dice. The darned blank slithered through like a wet, slippery gliding past a blank of a blank. So instead, I just whacked harder, attacking my stiff blank with a hard blank. That failed too. I finally discovered that blank but firm blank placed in the blank just inside the lip of my blank without going over the edge. It was precarious business. If you pushed too hard, you were screwed. This was a temporary fix. So obviously, I wrote that specifically to be provocative, and I'll show you the actual writing of it later. But that's just to demonstrate one example of things that can go wrong during bottling. The funny thing is, I wrote that in 2013, and the anxiety, the panic of bottling still applies today. So I have that experience to share with you. If you've ever had the late harvest Sauvignon Blanc, you know that with that wine, we had to place all the foils by hand because they kept pleating. Let's see, there was 2015, I think, when I was bottling the Torrey Hill, when the little escalator that carries the bottles around through the bottling line broke, like the tiles started sputtering off like a deck of cards. And my wine was already in the bowl, it was in the lines, and it was starting to get hot. So I was panicking. The guy in the bottling truck locked himself inside and wouldn't give me any updates. And every 15 minutes, I was hosing everything down with cold water to try to keep the tank cold. Let's see what else. Oh, there was the time that the labels didn't go on properly. So the bottling line just stuck new labels on top of it and thought I wouldn't notice. So there I was, like I Love Lucy, trying to pull them off the line fast enough that we could get everything relabeled. So there's so many moving parts, which makes bottling exciting and chaotic. So I was just going to sort of ask you guys, what is the purpose of bottling? Anyone can kind of like unmute and shout it out. Why do we bottle wine? Well, obviously, it's not very practical for me to send a whole barrel in the mail to you guys, right? I mean, I know you guys are all fans, but nobody wants a giant barrel and have the truck backing up, right? Beep, beep, beep. Go ahead, Mike. Why are we bottling?
To get it to us.
Yeah, to get it to you, but to get it to you how? What's really that goal?
Well, it's going to be in a supposedly safe container that will preserve and also continue the aging process of that wine.
You are absolutely right. So the number one goal—
I was raising my hand, it's because I would take a barrel.
Thank you for that. So yes, and thank you for participating. You're absolutely right. So of course, the reason that we bottle is to get the wine to you in a stable way, right? We want the wine when you get it at your house and when you open it with a meal to be as delicious and taste the same way it does at the winery with me before I bottle it. So for us, really from a winemaking perspective, it's about stability and clarity in making sure the wine has its integrity and ages beautifully. And there's a lot of things we can do to keep wine stable. And that's sort of the drier side of bottling. And then of course, sort of the more fun part, I suppose, is the aesthetics and the packaging, which really isn't my wheelhouse. I'm sort of more of the science girls, but we'll talk a little bit about both. So let's start talking a little bit about wine stability. And if you guys have questions, throw them into the chat box. Yes, S-rated. X-rated indeed, Alan. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and let's talk a little bit about stability here for a minute and the different components of stability. And sometimes oh, there we go. I'm going to go back one. So the reason stability is important is not only because we want the wine to not be fizzy, we don't want it to have off odors or off colors, but because consumer perception is so inextricably linked to stability and the visual clarity of the wine and quality, right? And that's especially true for white wines and rosés. We want them to be sparklingly beautiful. We want them to be totally clear. And for us here in California, summers are warm and it's warm across the United States and it gets cold in the winter. So we want to make sure that the wines that we have get to you in the proper condition, whether it's hot or cold. And obviously we can't buffer the wine against the extremes of temperature, but there's a lot of things that we can do to help ensure that the wine stays stable and clear. So, you know, it's easier to prevent problems proactively than it is to, you know, fix them once they're in the bottle, obviously. If a wine gets to you and you open it and it smells terrible or it's fizzy, those are all problems that should have been fixed sooner. And you know what? I can share a bottling stability story with you guys. That we just had personally. So we had ordered some Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand from an online website, from an online distributor, importer, and that wine was bottled under a screw cap. Okay, does anybody know, does a screw cap give you more or less oxygen than a cork? What do you guys think? It's 50-50. Anyone can shout it out.
Less.
Yes, there's less oxygen with a screw cap than you're going to get with cork. So what happened was we opened this first bottle of Sauvignon Blanc and it smelled terrible. It smelled like canned vegetables, like durian fruit. It smelled awful. And I'm like, I think this is a reduction problem. And we opened a second bottle, and sure enough. And I brought a bottle to the winery to show to the production crew so they could get a good example of this problem. I shared a wine with one of my best friends who's a winemaker who made wine in New Zealand and Australia, and we all agreed this was a reduction problem. So it smelled really bad, and a reduction problem is where you don't get enough oxygen. And my hunch is that they tried to fix the smelly wine when it was in the tank by giving it oxygen and trying to get it to blow off. And then when they bottled it with a screw cap, they suddenly took all that oxygen away, and they converted those smelly things back to stuff with a very low sensory threshold. So as soon as we opened the bottle, it smelled terrible. Have any of you guys ever opened a wine that has had a stability issue? No one? No one's ever had a wine that was corked, or a wine that had any kind of sediment or wine crystals? Yeah, I see Steve nodding. Go ahead, unmute yourself.
We've had crystals.
Yes, but it's interesting you bring up the New Zealand, because I haven't had that experience with any New Zealand Sauvignon Blancs. I had it actually with corked wines, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, sometimes you can even tell as you pull the cork out, things are not just quite right.
Absolutely, absolutely right. And in New Zealand, because they bottle so many things with screw caps, they're generally really attuned to reduction problems. I think just for whatever reason, this one just got overlooked. And I think they probably, it's some of these smelly components are in flux, whether the wine sees more or less oxygen, and it pushes those smelly compounds in different directions. And I think they probably thought they fixed it, and then they bottled it under screw cap, and all these smelly things just sort of bloomed. So let me go back to the slide so we can just sort of talk a little bit about sort of all of the different categories of things that can go wrong. So I actually put this in here first. This is a photo from an email that someone sent to me regarding a bottle of Tory Hill, and I actually can't remember the vintage. But he was very, very upset. He opened this wine and oh no, it was Gaps. It was Gaps, and he demanded to know, why didn't you filter this wine? The quality of this wine is terrible. I've never seen sediment like this before in a Pinot Noir. And the implication was that I was a bad winemaker or a careless winemaker. And the reality really is that we want our wines to be perfect. We want them to be stable. We want them to be perfect at your house. And this was the only person who emailed me about this particular vintage of Gaps having sediment in the bottle. And my hunch is that his cellar was a little bit colder than average cellar temperature, and it just caused some of these crystals to precipitate at the bottom of the bottle, and that stuff's going to settle to the bottom, and that's going to happen. And these things happen because wine is complicated, right? Wine is more than just alcohol and color and acid, right? So this is about as technical as we're going to get. But wine is something called a colloid, and a colloid just basically means that it's a complex liquid that's filled with lots of little teeny particles. And those particles aren't like, they don't bind to the liquid itself. And they also don't stick together in a group and drop out of it and precipitate. They're just sort of sprinkled through this matrix, and we can't really see them. So another example of a colloid that you guys know is smoke. Smoke's a colloid. Fog is a colloid. Whipped egg whites are a colloid, right? So it just means teeny particles. And in egg whites, it's albumin, right? It's the protein that expands everything and makes it big and fluffy. But it just refers to tiny particles floating in some kind of a matrix. And in wine, they can be positively charged, they can be negatively charged, they can be attracted to each other. If you mix two wines together, sometimes the positive and the negative charges stick together and drop out, and then other times they don't, and it causes a haze. And because we have all these little microscopic components that we need to think about, that's sort of what makes bottling and stability so complicated. And this colloid matrix is a lot more salient when you're bottling rosé wines and white wines. In general, red wines tend to be more stable. We know that over time, that red wines are going to drop out precipitates, right? You know, sediment as it ages, and that's totally normal for a wine at 4, 5, 6 and longer. But we really don't expect that in a rosé or a Chardonnay or a Sauvignon Blanc or a white wine. Can anyone venture a hunch as to maybe why red wines are naturally more stable? Anyone have a guess? Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
Is it the tannins that
Yeah, yes.
help with the structure?
Yep, you are absolutely right. So the tannins bind stuff up, right? So color molecules are positively charged. The phenols, the polyphenols that are in wine, the tannins, those are negatively charged. So they'll bind together and they'll bind to other things. And tannins naturally like to stick to other things. So if there's unstable components in the wine, those tannins are just sort of like little sticky fingers that grab them all up. So in general, red wines tend to be much more stable in terms of protein, in terms of cold stability, which we talk about in terms of tartrates in the wine diamonds that people sometimes see in white wine. So we don't have to do as much proactively to stabilize a red wine as compared to a white wine. So let's just take a quick look quickly at just some of what those little components are. We're not going to talk about them in any particular depth. But, you know, so these are just some of the little tiny things that you can find in wine. And of course, there's yeast and bacteria. And for the most part, once wine has been sitting in a barrel or in a tank after fermentation, all of those dead yeast and bacteria settle down to the bottom. And when we rack stuff out, it's clean. But we're not going to get every single, you know, piece of bacteria, necessarily dead bacteria, out of the wine. So all of these things ultimately could be a source of any kind of haze. So we can divide stability into a bunch of very broad categories, and we're not going to go into them particularly in too much depth. But of course, you know, we can think about these broad categories a little bit, right? So we can talk about microbial stability. So if something's not stable in terms of microbiology, what might you find in the bottle? Any guesses? What if there is, let's talk about maybe some of the big production wines, like Gallo or something, where the wines tend to be sweet. If there's sugar that's left in the bottle and the wine's not sterile and it gets bottled, what can end up with your wine? What can you end up with? Any guesses? Fizzy wine, right? So if you even have just a few yeast or bacteria in a bottle that's closed with sugar in it, you're going to end up with a fizzy wine that you don't want. And with microbial stability, of course, you also think about all of the bad actors that cause bad odors in wine. We think about color. With rosé, we think about, is the pink color that we have going to be stable? Is the color that the wine is when it finishes fermentation, will that color last when it's bottled? Can we boost the color? And if we boost the color by adding, as I do, a little bit of finished Pinot Noir, will that color be stable? And we also think about color stability, of course, in red wines, whereas we think about clarity more with white wines. And with those are sort of, we can also think about the colloidal. And for that, we can talk about protein stability, which is really heat stability. We have oxidative problems and reductive problems, right? So we have problems where maybe a cork is loose, maybe a cork leaked or went in on an angle, and now we have too much air coming in. And you can end up with a wine that's brown. You can end up with a wine that's leaking around the cork if there was a temperature flux. And lastly, we think about cork taint as just sort of another broad category of bottling stability. I'm hoping that our cork guy, Daniel, has agreed to join me for the cork interview. So I'm not going to talk too much in depth about cork, but as you can see, there's a lot of broad categories that we have to deal with when we're thinking about wine stability. And then on top of that, you know, we think about, is my wine stable? So is it stable against all these things? And then we think about, How can I stabilize my wine, and do I want to stabilize my wine? So, with red wines, I often very much take the tack that anything that's going to precipitate is, going to be tannin that stuck to some acid and it formed a light sediment. And in modern winemaking, as we have wines with more extracted color and more extracted tannins, those wines just are inherently less stable. Which is why if you had 2016 gaps, there were people, me included, who pulled the cork out of that 2016 gaps. And if you looked on the underside, you could see some little colored crystals where tannins with anthocyanins had precipitated out with a little bit of acid that had come out of solution. And I had filtered the wine, and there was no sediment when it went into the bottle. But it's possible that it got a little bit cooler in the warehouse and that just super saturated and pushed those things out of solution. That said, I've sort of always made the executive decision to not add things to proactively stabilize color in the red wines. That's a very different decision that I use on rosé and white wines, where I do actively want to add things to ensure that they're stable. So some of the things, can you think of some of the places between bottling and your home that might be causes of wine instability? Go ahead, Alan.
I was going to say in Texas, with the temperature, shipping, yeah.
Absolutely.
Horrible.
Yep, you're absolutely right. So heat can cause corks to push. It can cause corks to leak. But really the thing we worry about most is a protein haze. So when wine gets hot, it monkeys with that colloid matrix that we talked about, and it pushes proteins out of solution, and your wine ends up being hazy, and it just doesn't look pretty. No one wants a hazy, cloudy rosé, especially on a hot Texas summer day, right? And then the opposite extreme of heat is cold, absolutely. So Mike, what's the problem with cold? What do you end up with? Do you know?
Well, I would think it's going to create a little bit of the fizziness that you talked about.
It can. The thing we worry about most with cold is the stability of the acids. I know I've mentioned before that wine has a lot of acids and they sit in equilibrium, and they're usually super saturated. Which means that there's a lot of it in there and it's just in solution, just barely, right? So you think about pouring salt into water and it just sits there. But if you heat up a pot of salty water, when it starts to boiling and you stir it, the salt goes into solution. But as it cools down, it can pop out. The same thing happens with wine. So that's really what we worry about with cold. And if you've ever put a bottle of Chardonnay or Rosé in the fridge, which is colder than cellar temperature, and forgotten about it for a few weeks, has anyone looked at the bottom of the bottle? Has anyone seen anything? Ever? The little, they call wine diamonds, wine crystals? You guys see that? Yeah, I see everybody nodding, right? So you see those little tiny fine guys floating at the bottom. Those are just some acids that have precipitated as salts. I mean, they're totally aesthetic. It doesn't change the flavor or the texture, but it's another thing about consumer perception. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys one more time before I let Brian see if we can do a couple videos of the bottling line, right? So this is, again, like, do I want to stabilize my wine? What are my choices? So I just put this picture up today because just today I was at the winery filtering all my wines to get ready for bottling. And I do cross-flow filtration, which is a very, very gentle technique that moves the wine through all of these various different columns. And it pulls out big particles. So that means if there's any kind of dead yeast, if there's any kind of dead bacteria, if there's any precipitated acid salts, if there's any precipitated pieces of color, it will keep those behind in something called the permeate, and then we throw that away, and then the retentate is what's left, and that's crystal clear. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing, and we're going to see if Brian can share a couple oh, Mike has a question first. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Are you bubbling up from the bottom there? on that
It-
filter?
Yeah, so it actually passes through.
Each of
So
those chambers?
Yeah, it gets hooked up to gas, and it's got like a canister and a filter within it. And we hook it up to gas, and it sort of bubbles up through, and it pushes in and out through this filter in each of those chambers.
Okay.
And then at the end, sort of like there's gunky stuff that comes out that I throw away. Go ahead, Alan.
So it's a physical filtration system.
That is correct. It's a very,
Okay.
very gentle physical filtration system. Instead of like a pad filter, which would push everything through in one fell swoop, this is slowly recirculating the wine through all of these different chambers. So it's considered to be a very gentle form of filtration. In fact, the machines are so expensive, we don't own one. The winery doesn't own one. Grand Cru doesn't own one. We bring in a filtration guy. And sometimes bottling companies have their own cross flow machines. And, you know, we just pay per gallon that goes through the machine. Other questions? All right, I'm going to see if Brian can share a couple 5-second clips of the bottling line. Pressure's on, pressure's on. All right, well, I see the picture. Let's see. Oh, yeah. It's very slow. It's like a 5-second clip. Okay, so we have one more clip. They're not as exciting when they're slow, are they? So there again was just a quick clip of the bottling truck. So we schedule a truck to come. It gets hooked up to electricity. It gets hooked up, obviously, to gas. All the wine is in a tank. We push it through a hose, through the tank into the bowl of the truck, and it goes through the bottling line. So I have the Chardonnay. I picked those video clips just really because I thought I could talk very briefly about cold stability. So there's sort of two ways to think about and manage cold stability to prevent those wine diamonds from precipitating. So way number one would be to force the wine to get really, really, really cold and to keep it there really, really, really cold. And it forces all of those unstable acids to bind up with some potassium, and it precipitates out as a salt. And you see it as like, literally looks like white salt at the bottom of the tank. You keep the wine cold and you rack it off that, and then you're stable. And that's sort of the old school way that people were doing it for years. Sometimes we would seed it with cream of tartar. So you'd pour in cream of tartar and stir, 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 hoping that if you put in a little bit of cream of tartar, it would sort of encourage that super saturation to seed and start everything to suddenly precipitate out. That's well and good. It requires a lot of energy. So you put it in this big jacketed tank where it's really, really cold for 2 to 3 weeks. And obviously you have to rack it off when it's cold as well, or it goes back in solution. So it's not like the greenest solution. It requires a pretty big volume of wine. If you have a small volume, it's really hard to chill it down that much. And it's out of the tank for a much longer period of time. So in the past 12 years, there's sort of been a newer approach, which is adding something to the wine that holds the crystals in place, and it prevents them from coming together to form the salt crystals. So again, you can deal with these crystals by taking them away or adding something to the wine that locks them in place. And I've been in the camp of adding something to the wine that locks them in place. For me, I feel like I said, number one, it's not very green to have this big chilled tank for 3 weeks with this small amount of wine in it. And also it can pick up a lot of dissolved oxygen, right? And we always are trying to protect the color and the integrity of delicate white wines and rosé. So for me, the added effect has been super, super cool. So from there, let me share the screen and I will read to you guys the actual Mad Lib. So, Mother Fairy Godmother Jiminy Cricket, I sputtered under my breath. My glistening red hand corker stood erect beside the truck. It was brand new. I couldn't wait to hand cork my large format bottles. I was brimming with anticipation. I thought I knew what to expect. The day before, I'd practiced corking someone else's magnums. I'd experimented with the lug nut, so every thrust inserted the cork into my bottleneck just right. Each push felt smooth and firm. I wanted the tip of my cork to barely kiss the lip of the bottle, both parts lying flush. It's a matter of wrist action. But today was totally different. When I walked up, I saw a cork floating inside the first magnum, bobbing up and down the sea of Pinot Noir like a miniature buoy. Apparently, my 23mm corks were too narrow to plug the bottleneck. Each thrust of the corker pushed the cork straight through the bottleneck and into the bottle. I panicked. I tried pushing more gently. I slowed each arm pump to squeeze my corks more firmly before nudging the cork inside. No dice. Those darn corks slithered through the bottleneck like wet, slippery steelhead salmon gliding past a tributary of the Russian River. So instead, I just whacked harder, attacking my stiff corks with a hard knock. That failed too. I finally discovered that steady but firm pressure placed the cork just inside the lip of my magnum without going over the edge. It was precarious business. If you pushed too hard, you were screwed. At least it was a temporary fix. So that sort of brings me to the nuts and bolts of bottling. So that happened to me in 2013, and I continue to hand cork all of the magnums just because it costs so much to do a line change for 12 bottles. And I still have that Redahan corker. It's at the winery at the ready for Monday. And it usually works just fine. The biggest headache we have is with the Magnum Rosé bottles because the neck is so long. So 3 years ago when we first started doing the Hock bottles, I got ready to do the Magnums and I put them into my hand corker and realized that the neck was extending beyond the arm. Like you couldn't put it down, you would like shear off the top 4 inches of the bottle. So from there, we closed everything back up and I called my best friend and she's like, oh, I have a hand corker where we took the arm and soldered in an extra few inches so we could get our 3 liters in there. I tried that, still didn't work. Finally, in the end, I bought this funny, like from a brewery, I think, like crown cap hand corker on Amazon for like $11.99. And that worked for the 12 bottles. And now going forward, I need to take them over to my friend Jeff Pizzoni's winery because he has a very slick gas-powered hand corker that can incorporate the Hock Magnums. But that brings us to sort of the nuts and bolts of the other part of bottling, which is all the stuff, right? So when we talk about bottling, you need glass, you need labels, you need corks or screw caps, you need foils or wax or none of the above. What am I missing? Glass, corks, foils. I know I'm missing something here. Bottles, of course, bottles, thank you.
Labels.
Labeled, of course, right? And we all know from listening to me talk about the different AVAs, of course, that labels are a federal document. So what you put on the label needs to be truthful, and what you put on the label has implications for the consumer. So you can put all this romantic copy on the back, but you still have to hit certain criteria from a legal standpoint of what can go onto a label. So how are we on?
Also,
What was that?
boxes.
Yeah. Boxes, right? And then what are you going to get custom boxes? Are you going to get plain boxes? How are you going to, and you know, we actually have to affix a little like an Avery label to all of the cases because those also have specific legal information that needs to be on the outside of the case box. Sometimes it's printed, sometimes it's not. There are specific volumes for wine. So everyone knows about a 750 and Magnums, Methuselahs, half bottles. Anybody know the reason that canned wine is often sold in a 4-pack? The reason is that 125 mLs or whatever those little cans are is not a legal volume for wine. So this is federally mandated too. So they have to put them in a 4-pack so that it fits into one of the categories that are federally mandated for alcohol volume for wine. So there's all these funny little things, and I wish we could go to bottling.com and buy all our supplies from the same place. But of course that doesn't happen because All of those different components always come from different purveyors. So I'm going to start with a picture that Brian actually forgot about. And take a look at this picture. So this is my Zinfandel. And you can see in the middle a bottling snafu. Can you see what went wrong with that wine? Anyone? Is that even my foil? No.
I was going to say, those are not your caps.
Are even not capsules. So the capsules from the person who was bottling before I did, like 2.5 or 3 cases of my wine with my label. It was my wine, it was my glass, it was my box, it was my label, it was labeled properly. They put on her foils. And I guess they weren't paying attention because I'm B. Brulium and she was also a B, and they just must have assumed those were my foils. But yeah, I had a couple cases with Catherine Blagden's foil. So let me share the screen again, and I got another funny picture for you. So let's see. So there I am, right? Bottling Hawk Magnum glass is a headache. So in the end, I had this funny little thing that I bought on Amazon. And what's next to me down here is a pitcher of hot water. We couldn't even get the corks to slide in. We had to put them in hot water to sort of lubricate them before I put this thing over the top, which was good enough, you know, as I said, for 12 bottles. And then of course, here I am with my dad as we hand wax the rosé. Much to his chagrin, I make more rosé every year. I think he was really game to help when it was like, you know, 25 or 30 cases. Now that we're at like 200 cases, he's less happy to help me with the hot gluing of the wax. Oh, here's a good picture. So this was the year that labor didn't show up. So as I'm sure you've heard in a lot of places, there's a labor shortage. And this was not last year. This was, maybe this was 16 or 17. So yeah, so the labor line didn't show up for the bottling line. So here I am actually packing the wine. I'm one of the people on the line, which is fine. I don't mind the labor, but that just means I can't be on the sidelines checking bottles, making sure the labels are affixed, making sure that labels and foils aren't pleating or folding. So hopefully that'll never happen again. Oh, but wait, it did. Here's another time that I was bottling where labor didn't show up, and there I am again, packing the wine. So, right. So the COLA. So anytime that you have a label, obviously, as I said, it's a legal document. It gets submitted to the government and it gets approval. So of course, with Tory Hill, the joke is we change the art every year. So every year we need to resubmit it for a new COLA. So here's just sort of, you may have seen this before. This is just sort of the array of some of the labels over the years and the fact that we have to resubmit it. And here is the artwork for the forthcoming 2018 vintage that we're going to be releasing in the fall. I think it's super cute. I love the rainbow. I love the lettering that Amelia did. So that's just a sneak peek. Okay, so I put this up. This one's going to require some explaining. So on that one, the labeling people, you know, you've got a central core, like a toilet paper holder, right? Except it's really heavy duty cardboard and the labels are rolled around it, right? And it sits on the bottling line and they go through. So you can obviously roll them clockwise or counterclockwise. And the way that they should be rolled varies with the truck. Well, in that instance, the label people rolled them the wrong direction for every single label. So we had to hand unspool them and re-roll them in the opposite direction. So I'm telling you, I've bottled 26 times in my career and I have many more bottlings ahead, and you can never anticipate the snafus and the headaches that are forthcoming. You're like, oh, I've seen it all. No, I haven't seen it all. And so, so basically this was just a quick note about corks, right? So we have tons of choices now. You can do natural cork, you can do agglomerated cork. They have something called, the brand is Dion, but a bunch of people make them, and that's like a agglomerated cork that allows you to have a steady level of oxygen ingress, so you can monitor your total package oxygen. Of course, we're always thinking about headspace. When we bottle, the glasses get sparged with nitrogen before the wine goes in. And that's just a picture of me doing cork trials. And so In the olden days, I would get a number of bales, and I would get like 5 corks from the top, middle, and bottom, and they would sit overnight in boxed Franzia wine. It's always the same thing. And I would blindly go through and pick my bale, and then they'd reserve that bale of corks for me. Now we use Icon corks from Portacork, and every single cork is put into this machine that heats it up and tests for TCA using gas chromatography. And if there's any TCA, it gets shot out the side and it gets cleaned up and it goes back through the system in the future. So hopefully after having, I mean, natural cork, you're going to get some cork taint, but after my frustration reached a maximum and the technology was good, we switched over to the Icon corks. And with that, I'm at 43 minutes. So let me take some questions so I don't go too far over.
Okay. Whose responsibility is it to make sure the labor shows up? Yours, Grand Cru's, somebody else's?
Right, so that's a really good question. So when I was at the place where I was formerly making my wine, it is the responsibility of the person who's scheduling it, which was the winery and working under their bond, to make sure that the labor showed up. And the labor was so short that, you know, the bottling line, the people who own the bottling line don't often supply their own line of labor. So there's 2 or 3 people who run the bottling line, and they're great. They know what they're doing. They run the bottling line, you know, they're running the nitrogen. They're like, you know, they're busy the whole time. But you need people who are taking your empty glass and dumping it, making sure that the glass comes up equally along that, I call it the moving escalator. You need people who are checking the foils. You need people to pack the boxes. Then there's someone who tapes the boxes. There's someone who sticks a label on the outside, and then there's people who load the pallet. So sometimes there's just a separate labor pool that is distinct from the people who own the bottling truck. And in both of those instances, they were using like a temp labor service, and they thought the labor would show up and they didn't. Now we use a woman who brings her own labor force. She's great. It takes a crew of, is it 11 people or 9 people? I can't even remember now. I think it's like 11 people. It's all cash. Who wants to take a guess of what it costs per hour for labor?
$300.
It's like $28 an hour per person.
$28 per person.
Right, and it's like a crew of like 11 people. And that's just the labor. And like, if you try to skimp on labor, like she brings the whole crew, it just, you know, it's baked into the cost of bottling. But yeah, that's a great question. So now that we're with this specific different bottling line company, he always works with this woman who brings a labor crew. And you know what? It's way better than the temp service because these people are used to bottling every day. That's what they do every day.
What they're doing.
Yeah, they go winery to winery and they pack boxes and they rotate. So the person who's packing after like an hour is the, you know, whatever, the pallet loader. So since those 2 instances, we've always had plenty of labor, but you know, it's stuff is done by hand. It's not easy, and it's not inexpensive. Other questions? That was a good one.
Darren's got his hand up.
Oh, Darren, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was virtually raising my hand. Thank you. So my question is, I noted, I have all the bottles kind of laid out here. Most of them are the same shape. Do you have any, and I love, you know, the personalized label. This one's awesome.
Oh, yeah.
I love that. And do you have any plans to change your bottle shape in the future?
That's a really good question. So there are definitely traditional bottle shapes for specific varietals. So all of the Pinot Noirs tend to be in those bottles that have the longer neck with the fatter bottom. So within that silhouette, there's definitely different choices if you want like a higher punt, if you want like more of a slope, less of a slope. But in general, the silhouette or the shadow of all Pinot Noir bottles looks the same. We use a different shape bottle for the Zinfandel that goes into a Bordeaux bottle. There's also Syrah bottles. What we use for the rosé is Hock glass. The shape is called Hock, and it's traditional for Riesling actually. It's the Riesling glass, but it's really, really pretty, and it's become trendy for rosé. The dessert wine went into something that's called the Bellissima mold. For the most part, the molds of our glass are contingent on the varietal inside. There's definitely people who are doing really unique hand blown glass from Italy. There's a glass company called Savur, S-A-V-U-R, that has very expensive glass and some more sort of cutting edge shapes. But we've always been sort of more traditional within the silhouette. So I think we're probably going to stick with what we have now. The early vintages, we used glass that was much, much heavier. When I go back and pull out those 08s and 09s, I'm like, oh my God, this glass was so heavy. And there is definitely a quality perception with heavy glass, but on the other hand, the shipping of heavier glass just gets pushed on to the consumer. So in an effort to be sort of greener and more carbon friendly for all the wine that gets shipped out, we've just gone with lighter glass. But that's a good question. There's definitely more play, I think, with glass varietal in the spirits world compared to wine, especially sort of in my price point. People are sort of very traditional with bottling, at least the silhouettes.
There's a good question I don't know the answer to either. How are you going to manage bottling on Monday with COVID and social distancing on the back of a very tight truck?
That's a really good question. Obviously, we're all going to be wearing masks. We will be separated as best we can. We're generally not super duper shoulder to shoulder. People who are putting labels on things tend to be a little bit closer. As I said, we're going to do the best we can. We still need all the people there. So there's going to be two guys, sometimes they can be women, it's usually guys, who are inside the truck manning the truck. So they're actually inside the cab of the bottling line truck. And those are the people who own the bottling line. Everybody else is actually outside. So we're outside on the crush pad. So I think being outside is going to help. And again, wearing masks, washing hands. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be the same thing with harvest. Like we can't stand shoulder to shoulder. It's going to be slower, and we're going to have sort of a sorting, empty spot sorting. And we're going to, you know, try to keep elbow room for sure when we bottle on Monday. But yeah, that's a good question. Steve, you had a question too.
Yes, my question is, what ultimately drives your decision that says it's time to bottle? Is it the scheduling of the bottler? Is it something that's happening with the wine? And do you have a fair amount of leeway depending on when the bottler is available?
That's a great question. So the answer is yes to all of the above. So Pinot Noir sort of falls into two camps. There's either the people who do 10 months in oak so that they can bottle everything before the next harvest so those barrels can get reused. Mm-hmm. The second camp are people who, what we call over vintage. So it stays in the barrel past that next harvest. So they'd be in barrel for 14 or 16 months, and then they generally bottle right after harvest. And in that case, you need 2 full sets of barrels to always be in play. And beyond the cost of that, there's barrel maintenance. So, you know, you can't just keep an empty barrel empty, obviously, because wood is porous, right? And it's going to contract and get leaky. So you always have to have those barrels filled. And if they're not filled, they still need to be sanitized in some way so that you don't get bad actor microorganisms, spoilage organisms colonizing the inside of your barrel, because that's really a problem. Because it imparts that into the wine. So like I said, Pinot Noir people fall into 2 camps. We either bottle right before harvest or a few months after. Zinfandel does require more time for those tannins to develop and become soft, so that gets over vintaged. It very much also becomes, everyone's trying to bottle those first 2 weeks of August, and this year looks like it's going to be an earlier harvest. We usually bottle the first week of August. This year we're bottling about 3 weeks earlier, 2 weeks earlier, because that's when we could get the bottling line scheduled. So it comes down to a mix of both. Those bottling trucks bottle every single day somewhere in Napa or Sonoma. Places like Kendall-Jackson have their own bottling line, and they bottle 365 days a year with 2 crews, people making overtime. So bottling is definitely big business. And bottling also just sort of depends on your tannin quotient, right? So if you have a Napa Cabernet, like even over vintaging, you know, for 14 months in barrel is sometimes not enough to get those tannins to soften up and link and have that sort of more velvety texture on the palate. But because Pinot Noir is a low tannin varietal, and so is Zinfandel for that matter, we can get away with bottling at 10 months in oak, and longer than that sometimes will impart too much oak. That was a really good question.
Let's see, questions about foils. How and why do you choose between foil and wax, and what type of foil, tin versus otherwise?
Yeah, so that's a good question too. So tin foils are traditional. Tin foils are really malleable, so they go on really well. Tin foil is also expensive, but we've always opted for tin foils because it's sort of a quality issue. You'll definitely see more supermarket and value wines that are covered with foils that are maybe a plastic agglomerate. I can't even remember what the material is. Maverick is the company that does a lot of those, and they can be imprinted with like animals and different funky fun things, and they come in like a rainbow of 100 different colors. The tin foils tend to be more limited in the color selection. If you have custom foils like we do on the Pinot, those get made in France. They need to get ordered like 9 months ahead of bottling so they can come over on the container ship. And for the rosé, we weren't going to put foils on them because it was just sort of a value cost thing, and I didn't want to use the non-tin foils on the rosé, and we thought that the wax dollop looked really, really cute. So when I came up with the idea of the sparkly pink wax dollop, we just kind of stuck with it, and it became our thing. So that's really an aesthetic choice, right? So having the foil doesn't, you know, impact the quality of the wine per se. Like oxygen transfer rate is not related to whether it's foil or not. It's related to the cork and the porosity of the cork. But yeah, that's another aesthetic choice.
I don't remember the details of this. Maybe you do. Remember that movie Bottle Shock? I think it was a Montelena Chardonnay.
Yeah, it was
that
a
got
shock.
cloudy.
Yeah, I think that was Light Struck. So there's a number of these casses. C-A-S-S-E is the French word for haze, and these casses fall into different categories, and you can get an ion cast from having too much heavy metal. I think the Chateau Montelena story was something called Light Struck, which has to do with the wine somehow oxidizing when it's exposed to UV light. I think that's what it was. And when it's exposed to UV light, it undergoes some kind of a transformation. It's called Light Struck, and it causes a haze. And I believe that was the story of Bottle Shock for the Chateau Montelena.
But it was the wine that won the Judgment of Paris.
That's
And it actually
absolutely
went, per the movie, it went brown.
yes.
But then after a few days, it cleared back up.
Right. So in traditional Light Struck, it becomes oxidized by the UV light. And as you guys know, when wine is oxidized or age over time, it ultimately it gets, you know, VA, it gets that sherry smell, but white wines will turn brown. Absolutely. And per the myth of the story, it turned back. I've never, luckily, knock on wood, had a Light Struck wine. And here's a fun fact. The wine that won the Judgment of Paris at Chateau Montelena in Napa, the fruit from that vineyard actually came from Bacigalupi, which is a Sonoma winery or Sonoma vineyard in the Russian River Valley. And the Bacigalupi vineyard was actually the source of the fruit for the late harvest Sauvignon Blanc. So fun fact.
That's all I got.
All right, you guys. I tried to keep it at 45 minutes. We went 10 minutes over. I want to thank everybody, as always, for your time and your support. So hopefully this bottling seminar gave people who are looking for something more technical the technical information they needed, and for people who just wanted to hang out and have a funny story, you got that too. So cheers, everybody. Stay well, stay healthy.
Thank you.
I love seeing everybody. Bye-bye, Ellen. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
People locally,
Bye.
Lisa and
Stay
Sonoma,
safe.
people in New York, people in Texas, people in Washington, LA, Kansas, everybody, Arizona, everybody, Colorado. Stay well and be safe, you guys. Thanks.